You're listening to The Deep Dive, and if you've ever found yourself in one of those surprisingly heated debates about history, especially around this idea of Western civilization, this isn't just some dry academic thing.
Not at all.
For decades, particularly here in the U.S., discussions about teaching Western Civ have felt, well, like an either-or kind of fight.
Right. Either you're championing its virtues,
or you're pushing for a broader global history perspective. It's a debate that gets really emotional and often relies on some pretty big assumptions.
Exactly. And the very concept of Western civilization as this, foundational subject, it's been so central in education shaping identity for many. But what is it, really? Right. Today, we're diving into sources, particularly Peter and Stearns' Western Civilization and World History, which actually tries to bridge this very polarized discussion.
Okay, so our mission for you in this deep dive is to cut through some of that noise. We're aiming to extract the most important insights so you can really understand what Western civilization is.
Where it actually came from, yeah.
How it evolved, and its incredibly complex and honestly often surprising relationship with the rest of the world.
We'll look at defining features, moments of weakness, moments of strength.
And how the definition itself has changed over time. The goal here is for you to get the knowledge quickly but thoroughly. Hit those aha moments.
And hopefully not feel overwhelmed by it all.
Definitely. So let's unpack this. This deep dive is really going to question how Western Civ became such a cornerstone in education, what assumptions we've all made about it,
right,
and how we can maybe understand it better, not as the civilization, but as one of many in this incredibly diverse global tapestry.
So we're asking what it is, not just what it's often assumed to be.
Exactly.
And it's crucial to start by just acknowledging the battleground this topic has become. For nearly 2 decades, this West versus world debate has been really deeply entrenched in what we often call the culture wars.
Right.
On one side, you've got the cosmopolitans. They argue pretty logically that, hey, it's a globalized world. We need to understand the whole world. And some even see world history as a way to critically look at maybe some Western limitations, what they might call parochialisms.
Mm-hmm.
They're asking, are our Western values really universal?
And then you've got the other side, the more conservative viewpoint.
Yes. They often insist that Western civilization holds unique special values, seeing it as directly linked to fundamental American values, for example.
For them, it's almost like an antidote, right?
That's the term sometimes used, an antidote to globalization, or to what they see as declining youth values, or even to the increasing diversity of the population. It's a really profound clash.
It is. And here's where the problem, according to our source, really starts.
Go on.
This whole debate often assumes way more about Western Civ than it actually analyzes.
Like what, for instance?
Well, simple things like when did it really begin, or where was it even located in its earliest forms?
Okay.
And if you don't critically examine those basic assumptions, your understanding of history can get pretty distorted. It can turn history into, preaching or whitewashing instead of actual analysis.
And the source material is quite blunt about this. Bridging the gap between the extremes, those who just champion Western values unquestioningly, and those who engage in West bashing, as Stearns puts it. That's probably unlikely.
Yeah, that seems realistic.
But many still hope for some kind of compromise. We see attempts like world history courses that still spend maybe 2/3 of the time on the West.
But do those really work?
Well, our sources suggest they often fall short. They don't really do justice to the global issues or to a truly deep analysis of the West itself. It's a tough balance.
So what's the alternative presented here?
The premise of our source is that we can really improve our understanding by looking at Western Civ through a new lens, asking questions about it from a world history standpoint.
Okay, how does that work in practice?
Well, first, it means a willingness to maybe prune the facts a bit.
Meaning?
Letting go of, or maybe shortening, some familiar historical staples so we can think more flexibly, make new connections.
Okay, prune the facts. And second,
and this is key, seeing Western civilization not as the singular civilization, but as one of several.
Right. Not necessarily the oldest.
Not the oldest, not even the easiest to define, actually. Like all major civilizations, it's a complex mix of strengths and weaknesses, ups and downs.
And you can only really grasp it through comparison.
Exactly. Comparison and juxtaposition to larger, interconnected global processes. That's the framework.
Okay, with that framework in mind, let's tackle maybe the most fundamental and surprisingly tricky question. when did Western civilization actually begin?
Yeah, it's not straightforward.
Yeah.
Our source highlights that unlike many other major civilizations, maybe like China with its clearer lineage, Western civ's origins are unusually complex, and a big part of that is the fall of Rome. It created this huge disruption.
So it's less a straight line, more like...
More like a set of questions, an invitation to analysis and to debate, as the source puts it, not a simple factual story.
Okay, so let's look at the common starting points people claim. First up, Mesopotamia and Egypt, the really ancient ones.
Right. And it's true. Many societies like to claim ancient roots for, prestige. But trying to trace Western civ back to Mesopotamia and Egypt, well, it's highly problematic.
Why is that? They were hugely influential, weren't they?
Absolutely influential, incredible achievements. But they were fundamentally not Western. They were geographically distinct, for one.
Oh.
And their core systems, their cultures, they primarily influenced the Middle East and North Africa, not the area that became the West. Their essential coherence wasn't passed on to the West.
That's a really important distinction, and you mentioned a surprising fact that highlights this difference.
Yeah, it's quite striking. The practice of veiling women in public, which many might associate with later Islamic societies, it actually first developed in ancient Mesopotamia.
Wow, okay.
Yet there's no direct lineage of that very personal cultural custom to be found in the West. It really underscores how different their cultural legacies ultimately were.
So things like writing, iron, money, those spread, but they weren't uniquely Western inheritances.
Exactly. Those were vital, neutral tools, as the source calls them. Any civilization could and did adopt them. They don't define Western civ itself.
Okay.
Even when the Greeks borrowed things from Egypt, say, in mathematics, they added something uniquely Greek, this idea of a cosmos, a natural, explainable system, a concept the Egyptians lacked. That shows a clear conceptual break.
All right, so Mesopotamia and Egypt are out as the direct origin. What about the second common claim, classical Greece and Rome? That feels much more plausible, doesn't it?
It certainly seems more plausible on the surface. Many Western landmarks are Roman architecturally, and Western identity definitely borrows from the memory of Greece and Rome.
But our source says even this is problematic. How so? Greece and Rome feel so foundational.
Well, first, geographically. Greece wasn't actually located in what became the West. Greek leaders, Greek focus, it was mainly eastward.
Really? Towards Asia?
Yeah. Think about Alexander the Great's empire. It stretched across Asia and North Africa. It had basically no contact with what would become Western Europe.
Huh. I never really thought about the geography like that.
And the Greek legacy, culturally and intellectually, it actually fed ongoing traditions in Eastern Europe and the Middle East much more directly than in the West, at least initially.
Like Aristotle.
Exactly. Aristotle was studied, debated, hugely influential for Arab scholars, Byzantines, Russians.
Yeah.
Just as much, if not more initially, than for West Europeans.
And architecture, too, not just Western.
Right. Those classical styles influenced buildings in Turkey and Russia, not just in France or the U.S. So imagining this straight, unbroken line from ancient Greece directly to the modern West, it's just misleading.
Okay, geographical disconnect. What else? Socially.
Big social disconnects. Slavery, for instance. It was so central, so vivid in Greek and Roman society. But it simply did not become a defining characteristic feature of later Western civilization in the same way.
And popular culture. Religion.
Also largely disconnected.
Okay.
Western civilization's first clear unity, when it really starts to cohere, actually came through Christian culture, not through Greco-Roman popular religion.
That's a key point.
And here's another big one. Greco-Roman cultures showed a kind of remarkable lack of interest in production technology. They were much more focused on philosophy, politics, rhetoric.
So what did endure from Greece and Rome, if not a direct line?
Aspects of high art certainly did. Classical building styles, drama, and certain political ideas like political philosophy, theories of government, and Roman law.
But it wasn't a smooth transition.
Not at all. Even these legacies were often adopted through selective imitation much later. They didn't survive directly because of the deep rifts caused by the collapse of the Roman Empire in the West. That collapse was a major break.
And here's that aha moment you mentioned earlier about democracy.
Yeah, this one surprises many people. When early democratic stirrings began in Europe, centuries later, people never invoked Athens or ancient Greek democracy as their model.
Really? What did they invoke?
They invoked Christianity, the idea that all people have souls, are equal in God's eyes, or they looked back to the imagined equality of the Garden of Eden. So the idea of a specifically Western political tradition owes very little to direct survivals from Greece and Rome, except for high-level political theory and legal principles, which were rediscovered and reinterpreted.
Okay, so if not the ancients, and not really Greece and Rome directly, that brings us to the third option.
The medieval option. The Middle Ages, roughly 450 to 1450 CE.
Often called the Dark Ages, which doesn't sound very foundational.
Exactly. Despite those negative connotations, our source argues this period is the true foundation period of Western civilization.
That's a bold claim. Why the Middle Ages? What makes this period the real starting point?
It comes down to continuity. There are direct continuous links between medieval patterns and what came much, much later in the West, unlike the profound disruptions after Rome's fall.
Can you give some examples of that continuity?
Sure. Think about the formation of small central governments in places like England and France starting around the 11th century. That process leads directly in a traceable line to the modern nation-state.
Okay, that makes sense. What else?
Or consider scientific thinking. There was experimentation in the Middle Ages, combining rediscovered Greek science with, importantly, Arab science. This directly links, step by step, to the scientific revolution in the 17th century.
No major break there.
No huge rupture like after Rome.
Oh.
And the revival of trade in the Middle Ages created a continuous merchant tradition that flows right into modern business activities and eventually capitalism.
So it's about those traceable links. What were some of the most crucial, durable Western features born during this medieval period?
Okay, several really stand out. One absolutely foundational feature was the special role that merchants came to play.
How so? Weren't there merchants everywhere?
Yes, but unlike in many other advanced civilizations at the time, like the Muslim Middle East, Western merchants gained considerable autonomy and even a political voice. This was partly because the central governments were relatively weak.
Ah, so weak governments paradoxically empowered merchants.
In a way, yes. And this wasn't just a minor detail. It laid really significant groundwork for later commercial developments, for the rise of capitalism.
That's a powerful insight. What else emerged?
There was also this active, ongoing cultural tension between Christian faith and a revived interest in science and logic.
Faith and reason.
Exactly. This was partly borrowed from the Islamic world, which had preserved and built upon Greek thought. But this specific faith and reason debate proved particularly durable and, frankly, productive in the West over the long term.
Interesting. And technology. You mentioned Greco-Romans weren't interested.
Right. But medieval Europe became an eager borrower of technologies developed elsewhere. Things like the printing press from China, the compass, explosive powder, even the horse collar, which revolutionized agriculture.
Why were they so open to borrowing?
Partly, the source suggests, it was linked to Christianity's distinction between humankind and nature, which encouraged the idea of harnessing nature for human benefit. They weren't necessarily inventing everything, but they were quick to adopt useful tools.
Okay, so merchants, faith, reason, technology. What about the state itself? How did that medieval foundation shape it?
This is maybe the most crucial part. The Middle Ages generated the idea of a limited state, which had two key components.
Go on.
First, the Christian Church in the West developed its own independent institutional structure, separate from the state.
Unlike in Byzantium or the Islamic world.
Exactly. Where religious and political authority were often much more intertwined, this separation in the West allowed the Church to often act as a check on state power, a built-in tension.
Okay, church independence. What's the second component of the limited state?
The evolution of Western feudalism. It wasn't just lords and peasants. It involved specific contractual relationships between lords and their vassals.
And those contracts mattered.
Hugely. Because they were contracts, vassals could insist that the lord needed their consent, especially for new taxes. This led to the development of councils or parliaments.
The origins of parliament?
Yes, and this focus on financial control, the power of the purse, was really unique and became absolutely central to the Western parliamentary tradition. Think of England's parliament forcing the issue on taxes as early as 1295. This set the Western tradition apart from other councils around the world.
So, putting it all together, by the 11th, 12th centuries.
By then, you could say a coherent Western civilization was truly up and running. It had established a foundation comparable to, say, the rise of Islam or the classical periods in China and India for their own long-term traditions.
Okay, so we had this emerging Western civilization with its unique medieval foundations. But how did it fit into the wider world at that time? Because as you said, after Rome's fall, Western Europe was well, objectively backward compared to its neighbors.
Visibly backward, yeah. Technology was inferior. Cities were tiny compared to Constantinople or Baghdad. Muslim writers at the time often viewed Europeans as, frankly, barbarians.
Yeah.
Big bodies, harsh manners, dull understanding. That was the perception.
So how did they square that reality with their own self-image? They had the one true religion, the memory of Rome.
Exactly. It created this enduring paradox, this tension. They were warlike, convinced of their religious superiority, vaguely aware of a glorious Roman past, yet demonstrably weaker and less sophisticated than their neighbors.
That must have had some psychological effects.
Definitely. The source argues this long experience of vulnerability and backwardness had three durable and often contradictory effects. First, it instilled a deep, long-standing feeling of fear and inadequacy, a sense of being perpetually vulnerable.
Okay, insecurity makes sense. What's the second effect?
Second, it fueled an intense anger and a desire to, well, punish or retaliate. You see this vividly in the Crusades, starting around 1091.
Right, attacking the Holy Land.
Yes, but sometimes even attacking Christian Constantinople, and also the Reconquista in Spain, the centuries-long effort to push out Muslim rule. There was a vengeful, though also somewhat fearful desire to retaliate, as Stearns puts it.
Fear and anger. What was the third effect? You said it was contradictory.
It seems contradictory, but it was equally powerful. A strong desire to imitate those very neighbors they feared and resented.
Imitate, even while fighting them.
Yes. Western Europe, much like Japan and Russia, would later copy their own powerful neighbors, actively, eagerly borrowed from Muslim and Byzantine cultures during this period.
Wow. That's a really important point that often gets overlooked, doesn't it?
It's hugely overlooked. This imitation process was incredibly active, incredibly fruitful, and quietly shaped the West in profound ways.
So what specific areas are we talking about? What did they borrow?
Oh, it was incredibly wide-ranging. We're talking core scientific frameworks and philosophy. Many Greek works only became available to the West through Arabic translations and commentaries by thinkers like Averroes. This fundamentally shaped the whole faith and reason debate.
Okay, science and philosophy. What else?
Medicine, extensive copying from more advanced Arab medical knowledge. Vital technologies like the compass, the astrolabe for navigation, better map-making techniques, printing methods, explosive powder. Many of these came to Europe via the Arab world or China.
So practical, crucial stuff.
Absolutely crucial. But it wasn't just practical tools. It extended into culture and taste.
Like luxuries.
Yes. European elites developed a taste for foreign luxuries like spices and sugar. New culinary techniques, even things like sherbets, were copied from Islamic cultures. Advanced business methods, to accounting, banking procedures were learned from Muslim merchants.
Even architecture.
Even architecture. The soaring Gothic style with its tall spires seems to have been influenced by the minarets of mosques. And new ideas about etiquette, about refined manners, also spread from contact with upper-class Muslims.
It's really fascinating how deep and broad that influence was, but you mentioned it was often downplayed later.
Yes, and this is a crucial point in the source. The later Western civilization tradition tended to minimize this whole imitative process. It preferred to frame its revival as a recovery of its own classical past, rather than openly acknowledging this immense debt to the Islamic world.
So there's a strange mix of
respect and disdain. Europeans resented and attacked the very same societies they were actively learning from and imitating. It's a really complicated, ambivalent legacy from that formative period.
Okay, fast forward a bit. From around 1450 to 1850, the West's global position clearly changes dramatically. But the source argues it wasn't some overnight affair, right? Not a sudden rise.
Absolutely not. And the common narrative needs challenging. Many textbooks link early modern European exploration, Columbus, da Gama, directly to a new secular Renaissance spirit.
That sounds familiar.
Right. But it's misleading. First, the initial big ventures started before the Renaissance was fully established across Europe. And second, they were centered in Spain and Portugal, which weren't exactly the main hubs of Renaissance humanism and art.
So if it wasn't just a sudden burst of Renaissance spirit, what were the real drivers behind this explosion of European exploration and expansion?
Well, technology was key, but importantly, borrowed technology. The source emphasizes Europe's surge depended heavily on guns, sails, and navigational devices that were largely developed or refined elsewhere.
So their power grew where ships mattered most.
Exactly. Europe's power initially expanded mainly where naval tech was crucial, allowing them to seize ports, islands, control sea lanes.
What about the Americas? That seems different.
The Americas were a huge exception, yes. But that was largely due to a massive technological disjuncture. Indigenous peoples lacked metallurgy for weapons, they didn't have horses, and crucially, they were tragically devastated by European diseases they had no immunity to.
So Europe's success there wasn't just superior strategy.
It was more about this technological gap and disease. Globally, though, the source argues Europe's success was often in its agility in appropriating and essentially borrowed technology. Less about pure invention, more about smart adaptation and application.
That's a significant reframing. It wasn't just internal genius, but leveraging external tools.
Precisely. And the exploration was also rooted in a kind of problem-solving born from weakness.
Weakness? How so?
Europe had a severe, chronic balance of payments deficit with Asia. Elite Europeans desperately wanted Asian luxuries, spices, silks, porcelain.
Right.
But Europe produced little that Asians wanted in return, except for precious metals, silver, and gold. And Europe itself didn't have abundant sources of those initially.
So they needed to find a way to bypass the middlemen and get the goods directly. Or find new sources of wealth.
Exactly. And there was also a strong distaste, fueled by both economic and religious reasons, for relying on Muslim merchants who controlled the existing trade routes.
Especially after Constantinople fell.
Yes. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Turks in 1453 really intensified this desire to find alternative routes and led to, as the source says, a new aversion to imitating developments in the Islamic world. They wanted to break free from that dependence.
And this expansion, it wasn't exactly peaceful exploration, was it?
Not at all. This sense of embattled inferiority is really evident in the often brutal beginnings of European expansion. Vasco da Gama's second trip to India in 1502 is a stark example.
What happened?
He didn't arrive primarily with goods to trade. He brought a heavily armed fighting fleet. His goal was to use force to break the existing Muslim merchant networks. His brutal tactics reflected, according to Stearns, religious tension, even a sense of embattled inferiority, not confident superiority.
Wow. And that economic imbalance, where Europe wanted Asian goods more than Asia wanted European goods, that actually continued for a long time.
It did, for centuries. China, for instance, remained the world's dominant manufacturing power. It was the biggest importer of the silver pouring out of the New World mines controlled by Spain.
Why China?
Because they produced the silks, porcelains, and tea that Europeans and others wanted, and silver was one of the few things China desired in return in large quantities. This continued until China was basically forced open by British opium and military power in the 19th century.
So the rise of the West wasn't this simple, inevitable march to dominance?
Not at all. It was complex, often contested, and Europe's economic parity or superiority wasn't a given for a long time.
But eventually, around 1700 or so, a shift in European thinking did occur.
Yes. By about 1700, Europeans increasingly began to translate their growing technological prowess in ships, guns, clocks, etc., into a basis for judging other civilizations as wanting, as inferior.
Ah, the beginnings of that sense of superiority.
Exactly. A profound shift in outlook that moved away from the earlier imitation and ambivalence towards a more confident assertion of Western difference and, often, superiority. A sense that, as the source notes, still echoes today.
So while Western Europe was starting to project power globally, sometimes brutally, what was happening inside Europe, the transformations within its own borders from around the mid-17th century were equally profound, weren't they?
Absolutely. Europe was developing into what our source calls a really distinctive kind of unusual agricultural civilization. Changes were accelerating.
What was the most obvious change?
Increasing commercialization definitely became much more pervasive. Peasants weren't just farming for subsistence. They were producing more crops specifically for sale in markets.
Specialization, too.
Yes, regions started specializing wine in southern France, for example. Home manufacturing, the putting out system, grew rapidly, producing goods for wider sale. Money circulated much more widely. Europe was really pushing the boundaries of what a traditional agricultural society looked like.
And this must have had huge social consequences.
Massive. A new fundamental social division started to emerge, separating property owners from wage laborers. This gradually replaced the older serf-lord relationship as the main social dynamic.
Attitudes changed, too.
Yes. A new, harsher attitude towards poverty often took hold, blaming the poor for their condition rather than seeing it as misfortune or God's will.
And globally, did this internal commercialization connect outwards?
It did. European states started using policies like tariffs much more strategically to protect and promote their own nascent manufacturing industries, like limiting imports of Indian cotton textiles to boost their own cloth production.
And consumerism starts here.
The very first glimmers of modern consumerism appear in the 18th century. More shops, advertising, a greater interest in changing fashions and styles. It's the beginning of something big.
Fascinating. And politically, what was the trend?
The central state continued to grow stronger and more organized. Governments sent more representatives out to the provinces, developed more specialized bureaucracies, started requiring formal training for officials.
New roles for the state.
Definitely. States took on new functions in managing the economy, providing poor relief, however inadequately, and establishing institutions like prisons and police forces. It's a process of rationalization and expansion of state power.
And this connects to the idea of the nation-state.
Exactly. The ideal emerged that a state's political boundaries should roughly coincide with a shared cultural identity, a nation. This led to efforts like the Académie Française in France, trying to standardize the French language, promoting national unity.
You also mentioned a distinctive family structure evolving in Europe. What was unique about it?
Yes, starting from the late Middle Ages, this pattern solidified. It's often called the European-style family. Key features included relatively late marriage for ordinary people, women often marrying around 25 or 26, men even older.
Late marriage, why?
Often linked to needing enough resources to establish an independent household before marrying. This model also strongly emphasized the nuclear family unit, husband, wife, children, rather than larger extended family households being the norm.
Any other features?
Yes, a significant minority of people never married at all. And there were strong social sanctions against sex outside of marriage, though practice varied.
What were the consequences of this specific family pattern? It sounds quite different from other parts of the world.
It had profound effects. Because there were typically fewer adults in the household, it often led to greater practical equality in the economic roles of husbands and wives. Both had to contribute significantly.
So it ruffled gender relations.
That's the term the source uses. While formerly patriarchal, it created new underlying tensions and perhaps more room for assertions by women compared to some other systems. Protestantism also played a role, praising marriage and encouraging the idea of love within it.
And views on women changed.
By the 18th century, yes. The traditional Christian view of women as inherently more sinful than men started being challenged by arguments, often linked to the Enlightenment, suggesting that women's non-involvement in the rough-and-tumble world of commerce actually made them more moral than men, a significant shift.
Okay, commerce, state, family. What about popular culture? How is everyday life changing for ordinary people?
Big shifts there, too. Growing prosperity, even if unevenly distributed, fostered a new esteem for physical comfort. Simple things, like the increasing use of umbrellas, signal this change.
Individualism increasing.
Yes, commercialization tended to increase competitiveness and individualism, sometimes weakening traditional community bonds and reliance on neighbors.
Literacy, too.
Literacy rates rose significantly from the 16th century onwards, spurred by the printing press, but also by the practical needs of a market economy, reading contracts, keeping accounts. By the 18th century, Western Europe probably had higher literacy rates than anywhere else except maybe the British colonies in North America.
And the scientific revolution's impact. Did that trickle down?
It did, gradually. It further reduced the hold of traditional religion for some and encouraged new, more rational ways of thinking about the world.
You also mentioned a civilizing process. What does that mean?
This refers to changes, particularly among elites initially, towards more refined manners. Things like discouraging burping in public, stricter toilet training for children, maybe gentler forms of kissing, a greater emphasis on bodily control and public decorum.
Individuality showing up in other ways.
Yes, even in naming practices. Parents started naming babies more quickly after birth, stopped reusing the names of dead siblings as often, and showed a growing preference for novel or fashionable names. It reflects a growing sense of the child as a unique individual.
And attitudes towards children and love.
A growing belief in the validity and importance of love, both for children within the family and between courting couples seeking marriage. The ideal of marrying for love rather than just economic arrangement gained ground.
And that intriguing decline of magic you mentioned, how did that play out?
It's such a tangible shift. In 1600, if you locked your cow, you might genuinely go to a local cunning man or wise woman to use magic to find it. By 1750, you were far more likely to put an ad in the local newspaper or check a lost and found office. That practical reliance on magic faded.
Same for health.
Yes. Belief in witches, which had peaked in the 17th century, declined dramatically. People increasingly turned to doctors or commercial remedies advertised in papers, rather than relying solely on traditional folk magic for healing. It shows a fundamental shift in worldview towards more rational or commercial solutions.
So all these internal changes, commercial, political, social, cultural, sure, they really reposition the West.
Right.
But the source cautions against seeing them as entirely unique, right?
Exactly. It's crucial perspective. Many of these changes weren't globally novel. Europe was often catching up in certain areas.
Like what?
Well, effective central governments and trained bureaucracies. China had incredibly sophisticated versions of those centuries earlier, even things like improving manners. Many other courtly societies had highly refined codes of conduct.
And were all the Western changes necessarily good?
Not necessarily desirable from every perspective. The rise of the nation-state, while powerful, also fueled new kinds of intolerance and devastating wars. Extreme commercialism or individualism could be seen as undermining community. Even the decline of magic could be viewed as a loss of certain kinds of local knowledge or spiritual connection.
And it's important to remember other societies were also changing rapidly during this time.
Absolutely. Japan, for example, under the Tokugawa shogunate, saw significant developments in state power, literacy, and a distinct urban culture. The West wasn't the only dynamic region.
But these changes did give Europeans new criteria for judging others.
Yes, that's a key consequence. As Europeans changed their own family habits or embraced scientific explanations, they increasingly used these new norms to judge other cultures as superstitious or backward, which fueled their growing self-satisfaction.
And how did other cultures react to these Western changes?
It was complex. These changes often became targets for imitation elsewhere, adopting the nation-state model, Western science, military organization.
But not always admiration.
No, often it was what the source calls love-hate reactions. Things like Western ideas about women's roles, or intense individualism, or stark commercialism seemed undesirable or threatening to many other cultures. This created really complex patterns of adoption, adaptation, and outright rejection that continue to shape global interactions.
Let's talk about the map now. Where exactly was Western civilization? The source points out it's always had geographical ambiguities, even within Europe itself.
That's right. Defining the edges has always been tricky. Is Spain fully Western in the same way as France? What about Italy, with its distinct history? Or Scandinavia, or the complex region of East Central Europe?
And even within the core, Britain, France, Germany, there's huge internal diversity.
Exactly. It makes a neat, tidy definition difficult. So the source looks at three main types of societies that developed a special, but sometimes ambiguous relationship with Western Europe. Did they become Western?
Okay, let's start with the first case, Russia and Eastern Europe. How distinct were they initially?
Very distinct in the medieval period. Eastern Europe largely followed Orthodox Christianity, not Roman Catholicism. Its trade routes flowed more towards Constantinople and the Byzantine world. It didn't develop the same kind of feudalism as the West.
And the Mongol invasion?
The Mongol conquest in the 13th century further confirmed this separation, cutting Russia off from many European developments for a long time. So a clear historical distinction early on.
But then Peter the Great happens in the late 17th century.
Right. Peter the Great makes a conscious, forceful effort to pull Russia into a Western orbit, militarily, diplomatically, culturally.
How culturally?
Russia starts importing Western high culture, wholesale ballet, classical painting styles, Western literary forms. Later, great Russian artists like Pushkin in literature or Tchaikovsky in music and scientists like Pavlov would contribute actively to broader European culture. Russia also adopted Western-style absolutist political forms.
So lots of Western influence. But did Russia actually become Western?
The source argues no. It remained European, though also partly Asian but not Western. There were key gaps.
Like what?
Peter didn't foster a large, independent merchant class like in the West. Russia's economy remained largely dependent on exporting low-cost raw materials, like grain, timber, to pay for Western luxuries and technology.
Social structure, too.
Very different. Less urbanized, serfdom persisted until 1861, creating huge peasant problems. And crucially, Peter's reforms barely touched popular culture, the lives of ordinary Russians.
And there's that famous Russian ambivalence towards the West.
Exactly. Almost as soon as Peter started Westernizing, a strong anti-Western sentiment emerged, starting seriously around the 1730s. This Slavophile tradition argued for Russia's unique spiritual superiority, its strong community bonds, its powerful autocracy, contrasting it with perceived Western instability, materialism, and soullessness.
Communism later echoed some of that.
In some ways, yes. Communism fiercely attacked Western capitalism and political systems. This deep ambivalence, this unusual mixture of intense attraction and repulsion towards the West, became a fundamental recurring theme in Russian history.
What about the rest of East Central Europe? Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic?
It's a more mixed picture there.
Yeah.
These regions were largely Catholic or Protestant, so they participated more directly in Western cultural movements like the Renaissance, Reformation, Scientific Revolution, and Enlightenment. Some shared Western political values.
It's still distinct.
Yes.
Yeah.
Long-standing social and economic differences often remained larger peasantries, later abolition of serfdom. Economies often focused on exporting raw materials to the West. So the boundary there is, as the source says, not an easy one to draw definitively.
Okay, case 2, Latin America. This seems like it should be a clearer case for being Western, given the colonization by Spain and Portugal.
You'd think so, and there's certainly a huge amount of overlap. Unlike Russia, Latin America converted overwhelmingly to a clearly Western form of Christianity, Roman Catholicism.
Though often blended with other beliefs.
Yes, often syncretic, blended with indigenous and African beliefs, which perhaps contributed to a generally greater popular religiosity that eventually became common in modern Europe.
Politically.
Yeah.
Ultra.
Politically, Latin American elites actively participated in the Atlantic revolutions around 1800, adopting Enlightenment ideals, liberalism, republicanism. There's significant overlap in high culture, art, architecture, literature, with elites often traveling extensively in Europe and participating in Western trends.
So why the hesitation in classifying Latin America as fully Western? Where's the ambiguity?
It primarily comes down to economic and social forms. Latin America industrialized much later and less completely than Western Europe or North America.
Colonial legacy.
Exactly. Its economy was largely established as a colonial, dependent one, focused on exporting raw materials and cash crops. Sugar, coffee, minerals. It often had a large exploited rural population and significant social inequality.
And economic dependence on Europe and the U.S.
Yes. European and later U.S. economic dominance persisted well into the 20th century, and this economic dependence inevitably spilled over into political influence and cultural patterns. So despite the clear overlaps, these distinct economic and social patterns often lead scholars to consider Latin America a separate, albeit closely related, civilization. It's a mixed case.
All right, third case, the settler societies. The U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Do they make the strongest claim to being part of Western civilization?
The source argues they absolutely do. These societies developed primarily through the displacement or reduction of indigenous populations and massive emigration from Europe.
Strong ties to Britain, especially.
Yes, particularly the U.S., Canada, Australia, and New Zealand had primary political and economic ties to Britain. This facilitated the development of parliamentary forms of government and fostered the growth of large, influential merchant classes, similar to Europe.
Culturally and politically, too.
Strong cohesion there. They largely shared Protestant religious backgrounds, though Catholicism was significant too. They eagerly adopted and extended Enlightenment political theory. Their high culture rapidly mirrored European trends, and elites participated actively. Think of colonial Americans involved in Enlightenment science.
And economically, were they dependent like Latin America?
No, that's a key difference. They were not established as dependent economies in the same way. They managed their own trade more independently, developed their own powerful business classes, and industrialized rapidly. The U.S., for instance, copied British industrial techniques and industrialized on a timeline similar to France or Germany.
So very strong parallels. But there are differences, right? The whole idea of American exceptionalism, for instance.
Yes, distinctions exist. The U.S. famously lacked a major, durable socialist political movement, unlike Europe, Australia, or New Zealand. Historically, the U.S. has had higher rates of personal violence per capita, more like Latin America in that respect.
Other differences.
Americans have historically been more geographically mobile and generally more religious than contemporary Europeans. The U.S. lacked a hereditary aristocracy or a large traditional peasantry, making it more dominated by middle-class values, and perhaps a greater cultural tolerance for wealth inequality compared to many European societies.
But despite these differences, the similarities and fundamental trends were strong.
Very strong. The Industrial Revolution unfolded similarly. The demographic transition, the shift to lower birth rates and death rates, happened in parallel. Major social movements, like waves of feminism demanding access to the labor force, legal rights, voting rights, even the sexual revolution, later on these occurred across the Atlantic world.
Suggesting real cohesion.
Yes. The source concludes these parallels suggest significant cohesion within an expanded Western civilization. So overall, it's pretty accurate to speak of a common, expanded Western civilization encompassing Western Europe and these settler societies, with fewer definitional problems than trying to include Russia or Latin America fully.
Let's turn to the Industrial Revolution now. This massive transformation that literally reshaped the world. It clearly began in the West, first Britain, then spreading rapidly across Western Europe and those settler societies.
Right. And this gave the West immense global power for a significant period. Other societies really lagged, not fully starting to industrialize until the 1890s, or even later in many cases.
The huge question, though, is why the West? Why did it start there and not somewhere else, like China, which had been technologically advanced for centuries?
It's a classic historical question, and our source outlines three main approaches or levels of explanation.
Okay, what's the first approach?
The first stresses global causes. It argues the West industrialized primarily because of its unusual power position in world trade networks built up over the previous centuries.
So colonial profits fueled it.
Yes, profits from prior colonial ventures, including the Atlantic slave trade, provided capital that could be risked on new, uncertain industrial investments. This view emphasizes global exploitation and economic relationships, suggesting maybe no special internal Western values were needed, beyond perhaps a willingness to exploit global opportunities.
Okay, global power position. What's the second approach?
The second focuses on impersonal internal factors within Europe. Things like growing internal market opportunities fueled by that rising consumerism we talked about.
More demand for goods.
Right. Also, improvements in banking and finance, making investment capital more available. And rapid population expansion, partly thanks to new food sources like the potato from the Americas, created a larger labor force and also pushed many rural workers off the land and into cities seeking work in factories.
So demographics and internal economic forces, not necessarily unique ideas.
That's the emphasis of this second approach. It's about structural changes within Europe.
And the third approach, does that bring distinctive Western qualities back into the picture?
It does. This third approach argues that specific, pre-existing Western features provided the crucial final push that tipped the balance towards industrialization happening there first.
Like what kind of features?
Well, remember that pre-established emphasis on merchants. That might have laid a foundation for a more dynamic, risk-taking business spirit needed for industrial ventures.
Religious factors, too.
Possibly. Some argue that certain religious minorities, like Protestants or Quakers in Britain, perhaps saw economic success as a sign of divine grace, driving them towards innovation and hard work. And the Enlightenment provided a kind of intellectual justification for pursuing material achievement and taming nature. Think of figures like Matthew Bolton or Adam Smith.
And the value placed on technology.
Yes, that pre-existing Western commitment to technology and the tendency to measure societies by their technological level was enhanced by scientific arguments about understanding and controlling nature. James Watt improving the steam engine is a prime example.
Were governments involved?
Absolutely. Those growing central states we discussed earlier often actively promoted industrialization. They standardized weights, measures, and currencies. They supported banks. They invested heavily in infrastructure like canals and railroads, often initially for military reasons.
So it ties into existing Western state features.
Yes, the drive for rationalization and the intense military rivalry between European states both pushed governments to encourage industrial strength. So, the conclusion here is that while global factors and internal dynamics were crucial, some distinctive Western trends and values likely provided that final impetus, making industrialization's location not entirely accidental.
But the model itself, once created, wasn't exclusively Western.
No, absolutely not. Once the model existed, it could be adopted and adapted elsewhere, as Japan demonstrated so effectively later in the 19th century.
How did industrialization then change Western identity itself? It must have had a huge impact.
Profound impact. It certainly enhanced some existing traits that focus on technology and science as the measures of progress became even stronger. It also contributed to a general decline of traditional religion's influence in daily life, particularly in Europe, though less so in the U.S., interestingly.
And the family ideal?
It intensified that idealization of family life we talked about earlier. The home became seen as a haven in a heartless world, a refuge from the harsh realities of industrial work. Children were increasingly viewed as innocents to be nurtured, and women idealized as the angels presiding over this domestic sphere.
Did it create new values, too?
Yes, definitely. There was a huge upheaval in the arts, leading to what we call modern art abstraction, new forms, breaking from tradition. And architecture saw innovations like the skyscraper, largely an American invention driven by new technologies and urban pressures.
But you said maybe the most important addition was consumerism.
I think the source makes a strong case for that. Mass production created more goods, often stressful factory work created a need for release, and rising wages eventually provided the means. Life became increasingly defined by acquiring goods and participating in commercial leisure shopping in department stores, going to professional sports games, watching movies.
That sounds very familiar.
It's the foundation of modern Western life in many ways. But industrialism also created some complicated internal tensions for Western values.
How so?
Well, it promoted highly authoritarian structures within factories, strict discipline, rigid hierarchies. This created a stark dichotomy with the formal Western political values, emphasizing individual rights, control over authority, and freedom of expression.
Leading to conflict.
Absolutely. This tension fueled decades of labor unrest, the rise of socialist movements, and ongoing debates about economic justice. Governments also had to expand their functions significantly, providing housing, sanitation, more policing to manage the new urban industrial society.
And it raised that global question again.
Right. If non-Western societies like Japan could successfully industrialize, build modern cities, create effective education systems, even field competitive baseball teams that could beat American sailors, then were they Western? Was the West still definably different if its key marker, industrial power, could be adopted by others? The lines started blurring in new ways.
The 20th century then brought massive disruptions that really challenged the West's position and identity. World War I seems like a major turning point.
A catastrophic turning point. It shattered European dominance economically, allowing Japan and the U.S. to make huge gains. It fueled independence movements in the colonies. The Russian Revolution presented a direct ideological and geopolitical threat to the entire Western way of life.
And the war itself revealed immense state power.
Unprecedented state power over economies and individuals, raising big questions about whether this was compatible with traditional Western limits on government.
The interwar period saw some continuation of trends, like more liberal gender relations.
Yes, those continued. But it was also marked by the devastating Great Depression, which completely sapped economic strength and, crucially, Western confidence in its own systems.
And then came the horrifying rise of fascism and Nazism. How did that fit into the Western story? It seems almost anti-Western in some ways.
That's exactly the problem it posed. Fascist movements, particularly Nazism in Germany, contained blatantly anti-Western elements. They attacked individualism, parliamentary democracy, consumer culture, modern art, and the changing roles of women. Many core elements of the modern West.
So did this mean Germany under Nazism was not really Western? There was that argument, the Sonderweg?
Yes, the Sonderweg or special path argument became prominent. It suggested Germany's unique historical trajectory, the legacy of the Prussian military state, its late unification, the lingering power of the aristocracy, its rapid and disruptive industrialization, all made it somehow different, less flexible, and thus susceptible to Nazism. In this view, Nazism was a specifically German aberration, not a Western one.
Kind of lets the rest of the West off the hook, doesn't it?
It can seem that way. But there's a powerful counterargument which the source highlights. It holds that fascism was, in many disturbing ways, fundamentally Western.
How so?
Well, strong fascist or proto-fascist movements, often deeply anti-Semitic, existed in Italy, where it originated, France, Spain, and elsewhere. Fascism actually built upon existing Western features. The strong centralized state tradition, going back to absolutism, fervent nationalism, a Western invention, long histories of anti-Semitism, and the glorification of military virtues.
And the context mattered.
Hugely. Fascism leveraged the profound shock and disillusionment following World War I and the widespread fear of communism spreading from Russia. So this counter-argument insists the West is not off the hook. Fascism emerged from within Western traditions, revealing some of its darker potentialities.
Yet, incredibly, after the devastation of World War II, the West experienced an unexpected resurgence.
A remarkable revival. The West largely accepted decolonization, sometimes grudgingly. The Cold War, paradoxically, helped solidify a sense of Western unity against a common Soviet enemy.
What were the key changes that defined this post-war Western revival?
A major one was a renewed and perhaps deeper commitment to democracy, now generally understood to include multi-party systems, universal suffrage, including for women, and strong protections for individual freedoms. This became a core part of post-war Western identity.
And economically.
Rapid economic growth, the economic miracle, especially in war-torn countries like Germany, France, and Italy. This allowed for a swift resumption and expansion of those consumers' patterns, widespread ownership of appliances, cars, participation in commercial leisure. Women also continued to enter the formal labor force in large numbers.
Less nationalism.
A significant reduction in the old, virulent nationalism and militarism, at least within Western Europe. Old enemies like France and Germany buried the hatchet and spearheaded European cooperation through institutions like the Common Market, which became the European Union. Budgets shifted towards civilian spending. Europe began to be hailed as a region of civil societies.
So a period of renewed confidence, economic boom, and internal alignment. What about the relationship between the U.S. and Western Europe during this post-war era? Did they grow closer together or further apart?
It's interesting the source suggests both processes were happening simultaneously. There was significant convergence.
In what ways?
The traditional European aristocracy and peasantry largely disappeared, making European social structures look more like the historically middle-class dominated USP. Shared consumer products and popular culture became common. Think of the Americanization debates in France. Political extremes, both left and right, receded in Europe.
Racial divides.
Those narrowed somewhat, though complex issues remained. Europe saw more immigration of people of color, while the U.S. underwent the civil rights movement. Even things like child-rearing practices became more similar, with Europe adopting more flexible approaches that resembled earlier U.S. trends.
But divergences remained. They didn't become identical.
No, significant differences persisted. The U.S. never developed the kind of comprehensive welfare state common in Western Europe. European societies generally remain more committed to cushioning the effects of capitalism.
Income inequality. Work ethic.
Income inequality remained notably greater in the U.S. There was arguably a stronger work ethic culture in the U.S. compared to a greater emphasis on leisure time in Europe. And the U.S. remained distinctive in its social conservatism on some issues, higher rates of teenage pregnancy, continued use of the death penalty, a generally more moralistic tone in public discourse compared to secularized Europe.
But despite these differences, the overall picture was one of commonality.
Yes. The source concludes that despite the divergences, it's still accurate to speak of a common, expanded Western civilization that largely united the U.S. and Western Europe by the late 20th century. The similarities in core values, institutions, and lifestyles were profound.
Now let's look at the late 20th and early 21st century and the return of globalization. The source mentions a failed first round around 1900.
Right. There was an earlier period of intense global connection trade, investment, migration before World War I. But it collapsed due to the wars and the Great Depression.
And the West's attitude contributed to that failure.
The source argues yes. It reflected a kind of myopic Western assumption that globalization could be run largely by the West, for the West, without most of the globe really having an equal say. Think of the League of Nations, effectively a club for the states of Europe and their offshoots.
By the mid-20th century, the West's relative power had clearly declined somewhat.
Definitely. Decolonization meant the loss of direct political control over vast territories. The rise of other powers and the diffusion of military technology meant the West lost its earlier easy military advantage. And economically, power was increasingly shared, notably with Japan and the rapidly growing economies of the Pacific Rim.
Yet, globalization came roaring back towards the end of the century. What drove this new wave?
Several factors converged. Sustained high economic growth created powerful market forces pushing for integration. The collapse of the Soviet system removed a major barrier and alternative model. And crucially, new revolutionary technologies, satellites, fiber optics, the internet dramatically lowered the costs of communication and transportation.
And in this new globalization, the West played a dominant role, but maybe a more qualified one than before.
Exactly. Dominant, but qualified. In politics, for example, while the UN Security Council still reflects the post-WWII power balance favoring the West, the UN General Assembly is much more global. Yet the West retains disproportionate influence in key international economic bodies like the World Bank and the IMF. Western media, confidence, and cultural norms still heavily shape global political discourse.
What about the economy? Still Western-led?
Not solely Western anymore. It's more like the West plus Japan and the Pacific Rim still constitute the leading economic bloc, home to most multinational corporations and key technological innovation. Other regions, think China, India, Brazil, Oil producers are increasingly important actors, but a significant gap in wealth and influence generally remains.
Which leads to resentment.
Yes, protests against globalization often explicitly target Western corporations or institutions, blaming the West for perceived inequalities or exploitation.
And culturally, how dominant is the West in globalization?
Here, the source says, the influence is arguably Western through and through. Global popular culture, music, TV, movies is heavily dominated by Western, especially American, products and styles.
Fast food, fashion.
Fast food chains, Disney, Barbie dolls, blue jeans, revealing clothing styles, even ideals of body type. Western models are pervasive globally. Western tourism is a huge industry. And interestingly, even non-Western cultural successes often find global traction by taking on Western trappings. Bollywood movies blending Indian themes with Hollywood production values is a classic example.
So observers might easily equate globalization with Westernization, given this seemingly overwhelming package of influence.
It's an easy equation to make. And this raises two critical questions or consequences discussed in the source. First, the West becomes a target.
Because of this perceived dominance.
Exactly. Globalization fuels anti-Western sentiment. This can manifest as movements promoting regional identity, religious fundamentalism, seeking to resist secular Western values, and, in extreme cases, terrorism explicitly targeting Western economic or cultural symbols. It's a backlash.
And the second question is about homogenization. Will globalization just erase all cultural distinctiveness, make everywhere look the same?
That's the other big concern. And while there's undeniable convergence, especially in urban centers, consumer habits, and elite culture, the source argues that civilizational flavors persist.
Like in Japan.
Japan is a great example. It's highly modernized and westernized in many ways, but it maintains a distinctive parliamentary style, a strong group consciousness in business and society, even unique cultural forms like its sometimes brutal quiz shows. Or think of arranged marriage practices continuing widely in India alongside Western technology and business. Elites can become quite bicultural without necessarily losing their core identity.
Interestingly, despite the West's dominant role, many Westerners are also unhappy or anxious about globalization.
That's true. It's not just a one-way street of Western imposition. In Europe, there have been long-standing concerns about the Americanization of culture, or French worries about McDonald's or Hollywood's dominance. More recently, difficulties integrating immigrant populations, often from non-Western backgrounds, have fueled a significant rise in right-wing anti-immigration sentiment in many European countries.
And in the United States, what are the concerns?
In the U.S., anxieties often focus more on globalization, potentially modifying national sovereignty, leading to reluctance or outright withdrawal from international treaties or organizations perceived as constraining American freedom of action.
Yet, Westerners also often highlight tolerance as a key value today.
Yes, there's that paradox too. Many Westerners today see tolerance and openness to other cultures as defining Western qualities. And indeed, Western societies readily absorb foreign foods, music, and artistic styles into their own mainstream cultures. It's complex.
So wrapping this up, what's the final picture of Western civilization in the 21st century?
The source concludes that Western civilization is fundamentally a changing entity. It's not static. It has stood a test of considerable time, showing remarkable continuity while also constantly adding new features and adapting to challenges. It continues to play a hugely significant world role, but its future path, its relationship with other civilizations, and its own internal evolution are filled with complexities and uncertainties.
And here's where it gets really interesting, I think. We've journeyed through this idea, and it's clear Western civilization isn't some fixed monument we just look back at.
Not at all.
It's this dynamic, constantly shifting story. It's about adaptation, influence both given and received, and how it keeps redefining itself. From those, frankly, surprising medieval roots we discussed.
Right, not where most people think it started.
To its incredibly complex global interactions today. It's a narrative filled with, yes, remarkable achievements, but also some really difficult, uncomfortable truths.
And this really brings up a crucial question for right now. As the world gets more and more interconnected, as aspects of Westernization, technology, consumerism, political ideas spread globally, what does it actually mean to be Western in the 21st century? How can any civilization, including the West, maintain its distinctiveness, its core identity, while genuinely adapting to new global partners, new competitors, and, maybe most importantly, fully acknowledging the deep, often hidden influences that other traditions have had on its own development and experience?
So maybe consider this as we wrap up. In an age where global influences are just undeniable, can Western civilization truly understand itself without fully appreciating its long history of both leading and borrowing?
Both dominating and being fundamentally shaped by the wider world.
Exactly. What stands out to you thinking about this, about how its complicated past might inform its future? How does it move beyond, perhaps, what some might call those belligerent claims of superiority that arose at certain points?
Lots to think about there.
Definitely. The deep dive continues for you.